All right, so thank you for joining me this morning. Thanks for choosing this talk. I know there's like a lot of other tracks you could come to, so I'll try and make it worth your while. As I'm standing here, actually, I was in this room a few years ago. I think it was 2017 or 2018, and Gojko Ajic was giving a talk about humans that make computers go crazy. Was anyone here for that talk? Basically, that was one of the funniest talks I've ever been to. And for like 1 hour, the audience was just laughing like crazy. So I'm kind of glad you weren't there because this talk isn't going to be anywhere near that level. But I will share some things that make me excited. And to put things in context, my background's a software engineer, but over the last few years, I got more into consulting in the space of domain-driven design and setting up teams. So I'm going to share with you, things that get me excited, mostly practical, based on my experiences. So, first thing I'd like to give you an example of is this time, around pretty much a year ago to the day, actually, I was contacted by a German company. They were getting together for the first time after the pandemic, and they were like, could you come and do a workshop, a talk and a workshop around domain-driven design and team topologies near Berlin? I like Berlin, yeah. I'm available on that day. Sure, I'll do that. It's my kind of thing. And then it turned into near Berlin, a bit outside Berlin, and it's like, wow, it's a farm 1 hour north of Berlin in the place where, so far away from the city, people only really speak German there. So not quite what I expected, but it turned out to be, one of the memorable experiences I've got, certainly over the past few years. So basically, we're on this farm in Germany. We've got about 20 people in this room coming across 4 or 5 different teams, and we started mapping out their business process. And as we went through the session, as we started building up a picture of how their business works with event storming, we started to notice some patterns emerging. Effectively, at the start of their business process, they have to process some data, clean it up, and then that goes down to other parts of the process. Can't give away too much about the company, but they did post this LinkedIn post, so there's some information that's public I can share. They're in logistics, basically. And effectively, because they weren't able to have a perfect success rate of cleaning up this data and turning it into accurate addresses, it was having effects further down the process. Drivers weren't using the software because it was unreliable. That affects their managers, that people have to train them to use the software better. So effectively, by getting all of these people in the yoga room on a farm, we were able to see this picture. When everyone's work, sometimes it seems really obvious when you're all there in the room how it all fits together. But in a typical organization, people are just working in their team on their bit of the system, and they don't see this big end-to-end piece of the flow. And that's what we discovered here. We saw this problem that's starting in one team, and it's affecting all the other teams. We had some other great conversations as well. As we were talking through the event storm, I noticed there's a part of the process, there's a happy flow and then some edge cases. And I said to one of the developers, how often does that happen, that problem here? Is that a common problem? Is it a rare thing? Is it worth looking into? And the developer said, no, not really. Not something we worry about too much. And then because we had the customer support people in the room, or the customer success people, they were like, whoa, hang on a minute. I processed 2 of those support tickets this morning. Yeah, it's quite a common problem. So again, another one of the benefits is having all of these different people who have different skills, work on different parts of the product. We get insights like that, where people may have misunderstandings about the company, and all that comes together. As I noticed here, we had accounting in the workshop as well. So this is the kind of thing that I find is interesting, but I would also say this kind of activity where we're bringing the whole team together, one of the other benefits that comes out of this is it's not just about sharing knowledge, but it's enabling the whole team to start contributing ideas. And whenever I run event storming workshops, I always notice that the whole team, including the developers, they also have lots of ideas about how we can improve the product, how we can improve the business process. They're not just thinking, how can I implement this in software? They're thinking about, how can I make the whole process better? One of the other interesting things that happened in this workshop was, as we were walking through the timeline and telling the story, one of the team said, yeah, we could fix that problem if we had a certain API. It's in our backlog, but we're too busy to build that API. And one of the other teams said, oh, we actually have that API. We've already built that. So, two teams working on closely related parts of the system didn't even realize that one of the teams had solved a problem that the other team had. And so in the evening, the company allowed me and my colleague to stay with them and have a nice meal on the farm. It wasn't this room. It was like some old converted barnyard, but it was nice, big wooden tables and things, and we stayed for the wine tasting. And basically, in one of the corners, those two teams were sitting together, and they implemented that change on the same day. And again, that's another great thing about event storming. Get together, find a problem, discover something unique, and just solve it quickly, bring people together. And so I think this is important, or to me it's relevant, because as I talked about, I see developers as more than just writing code nowadays. When I do these event storming sessions, I'm seeing that the whole team creates good ideas. And if you look in the world of product management these days, product managers are saying the same kind of things too, that the best ideas are coming from the whole team working together. And that's what I'm seeing from event storming. And to put that more into picture, in more of a transition, this diagram here from John Cutler is an evolution in the way companies are working. Obviously, some companies are further down the process than others. Some companies still are working in a way that was common in the 90s, but in general, the average company is moving from the top towards the bottom of this. So, back in the 90s at the top, every team, every step in the process of building a product, every step in the process was a separate team, developers, testers, support the thing in production, the business make the requirements. And now we're getting to this row at the bottom where we have these autonomous, cross-functional, agile, whatever buzzword we want to use, but teams that are more empowered now. We talk about words like you build it, you run it, about supporting your code in production, but also on the left-hand side here, as I mentioned with event storming, teams that are more responsible for product features, product ideas, and the product roadmap. So this is where I see event storming and concepts like that fitting into this evolution of how companies are working. And if you ever get the chance, I recommend doing this activity, using this diagram from John Cutler, maybe with your company or with a company you're working with if you're a consultant, just asking them, a group of people, to put some dots on the diagram. I use a red dot for where you are now and a green dot for where you want to get to be. And even companies that are quite far up, they do tend to want to get towards the bottom. And doing this can also lead to some conversations where different people in the organization see things a bit differently, and that can lead to some good conversations. But in that diagram, going from those top layers to the bottom, where we have teams that are owning the product and making decisions and not just writing code, yeah, there's some change involved in that process. It's not like we decide to do it and it's an overnight switch. It does take a lot of effort to get there. So I don't want to oversimplify how long it takes to go through that process. Some companies still, I don't want to work in traditional ways, let's say, and they're happy with that way of working, or certain parts of the company are happy. So it's not easy to go through those different layers. But I think in general, over time, gradually, yeah, I do see that companies are moving more that way. On the other hand, I might also be biased because I talk about those kind of companies. I've worked in those kind of companies, so maybe I attract those kind of companies. So maybe my experience is quite different to yours. So on that theme, I also want to I'm getting a couple of caveats in here. I'm going to talk about ideas in this talk about how you can apply domain-driven design and team topologies to get to those kind of organizations. But like I said, it's not an overnight switch, and sometimes I end up in a situation like this where companies just think we'll have a couple of days of workshops to map out our business, and then we'll have a big reorg, and that's it. We carry on working as normal at that point. It's really, I don't want to oversimplify how difficult it is to apply these concepts in the talk. Which example was this here? Oh yeah, this was another example of that. This was probably the worst example. This was a German company. I work with German companies from time to time, some good, some bad. I'm not making any generalizations about German companies, but basically, in this example, a very similar thing. We had a 2-day workshop. We identified what might be the domain boundaries and how teams might be organized. And then on the second day, they told me, by the way, we've got a legacy monolith. It's 10 years old. It's got 50,000 business rules in C++. How long might it take to get from where we are now to this new structure? I'm like, oh, wow, that's years of effort. So I just want to get those caveats in. So on that diagram of John Cutler's, we talked about those different rows. And effectively, if you're in the space of team topologies, what John's describing on that bottom row of that empowered, autonomous, whatever you want to call it, team, he's describing what team topologies calls a stream-aligned team, a team that's aligned to a value stream, and a team that has a fast flow of changes. They're able to discover ideas and implement those ideas, get them in production very quickly. So when I talk about value streams in this talk, this diagram is what I'm talking about here. It's another one of those words: product, platform, domain, capability, value stream, all these generic and confusing and overloaded words. So when I use the word, this is what I'm talking about here. So the structure of this talk today, I've organized this into a narrative that represents the order in which I might do things in a typical example if we're starting with a new engagement, but you don't have to do things in this particular order. These concepts can be applied in different orders and different times. It's not a simple flow as I'm indicating here. Anyways, I'm going to talk first about how you can use event storming to identify potential value streams aligned to your domain, which can be the basis of your team organization or team topologies. In the second part, I'll then talk about how you can apply team topologies principles to assess and refine these boundaries we identify in event storming. And in the third part, I'll be talking about how you can use a concept from domain-driven design called core domains, or core supporting and generic subdomains, to identify. We've got all of these opportunities about how we could change our architecture and teams. Where are the most valuable areas to the business? Let's make a start on those first. Again, not the big reorg I was talking about earlier. So typically, when we run event storming sessions, what we're trying to do is to give everyone insights of the bigger picture of how things fit together, as I was talking about earlier. Typically, each team works in their area. They understand the bit of the system they're working in, and they understand some bits that are maybe overlapping or related, but they don't really see this big picture. So in this example here, if Team A has some inefficiency or some bug in their part of the system, it might be affecting Team E. Team E doesn't realize it's all the way back, starting in Team A's area, and Team A doesn't realize, oh, we're causing problems for Team D and Team E. It's just not visible, and that's what we visualize in event storming sessions. And so once we've got that bigger picture, then we can start identifying boundaries. Here's a very simple example of what event storming look like. This is nice and neat with 2 straight rows and things branching out. In reality, it's a complete mess, and it looks like some kids have just started sticking Post-its up on the wall. In fact, actually, I got a lot of Post-its in my house at home, and a couple of years ago, my friend came around, and they brought their kids, and just started sticking Post-its on the wall in my office in my house, and it looked just like an event storming session. So basically, this is the slide version of event storming. The real version is much more messy. But the idea is basically the same. We model our business using events, or we call them domain events. talking about things that happen in the domain or in the business. So as you can see here, the order's dropped off, and then we have two possible flows for it. On the top flow, the customer gets their food, they eat the food, and they leave a 5-star rating. On the bottom row, the driver's taken the food to the wrong address. The customer's got very angry and called the customer support team to complain. The reason we use events is because event storming is a lo-fi technique. We want to increase the engagement, inclusivity, so by having as few rules as possible, as few things to learn as possible, we can get a mixed group of people, like I talked about earlier. The example in Germany, got all those people together, they've never done event storming, they all work in different parts of the company, and we can have this amazing workshop because the amount of stuff you need to learn is very limited. And once you've mapped out your business with an event storm, it then becomes a foundation to have conversations about all kinds of things. Where are things broken? What opportunities are there? Where do we disagree about things? Where do we have gaps in our knowledge? Effectively, once you put things on the wall and you see it, it prompts you to have all kinds of conversations. Just making the business visible does that. As you can see here, a couple of examples of the kind of errors you can annotate on an event storm. And here with opportunities as well, you might map out parts of your business, and you might say, a good question as a facilitator, for example, is, so we've got a particular process here and a particular kind of customer. We might have a professional or a student, and we can ask a question like, how easy or how difficult would it be to adjust this process to target a new kind of customer, maybe someone who's older or younger, or a business? All these kind of questions become possible. And as a facilitator, even if you don't know much about the domain or the business you're working with, the event storm format makes it easy to ask these general questions, and you can uncover useful things just by knowing good questions to ask. So, very often, we use event storming as the starting point to identify domain boundaries, which become value stream boundaries, which become software boundaries, which become team boundaries. And one of the great ways to get started in that process, before we start putting circles around things and calling it the customer domain, the orders domain, and we start getting attached to these namings and concepts, there's actually a concept in event storming called pivotal events. And a pivotal event is, the simple definition is the end of a process or a sub-process. And by looking for where things finish, that's giving us clues about where the boundaries might be. And it encourages us to zoom in and talk about those things, and get more into the details before we start thinking about where are the domains and subdomains. I put some examples of the kind of clues you can see here that help you to identify if you found a pivotal event. I won't go through all of them, but for example, a very common one in domain-driven design is if we have the same person, but the way we refer to them before or after the pivotal event is different. So over on this side of the pivotal event, we call them a non-member, but on this side, we call them an applicant, for example. And so because we're calling that person a different name or a different word, their role has changed, that might indicate we're in a different subdomain with a different purpose and a different set of concepts that are applying here. Another thing that I recommend looking for is this concept of domain roles. People call it different things. I'm using the term domain roles, but effectively, we look for different personalities in the domain, if that's making any sense. But this example here, we've got these 3 subdomains, and we can classify their behavior in different ways. And by looking at these different behaviors, it can help us to identify, is there a nice clean split here? Or maybe in the future when this thing grows, this would be the place to split. So very, very simply, a specification subdomain or specification context, as DDD people might call it, it's an area of the business, it's a subdomain where the purpose is about building some description of something that should happen. In this example, I'm using the example of advertising or online advertising. So a user goes through multiple steps and they describe, I'd like to run an advertising campaign on Twitter. I want to have these creatives, these images and videos. I want to target this kind of people, this audience. I want to spend this much money. I want the advertising campaign to run at 7 p.m. at night and 4 p.m. in the morning. So at this point, all the user has done is created some description of what they want to happen. Nothing has actually changed at this point. They haven't paid for anything, or maybe they've paid. Is that a fire alarm? Okay, I'll continue. If anyone smells fire, let me know. If you smell smoke or see some flames, give me a wave or something. So yeah, the specification is about building some description of something that needs to happen. And then the next step is taking that specification and doing something with it. And so in this example, we've got advertising campaign runner. It takes a description of a campaign you want to run, and it manages the workflow and the state transitions like start, stop, pause, finish. You can't pause a campaign once it's finished. It's managing these workflows and rules as things are happening. And very often, not always, but that's a nice transition point for your domain boundaries. Specification over here, execution over here. There's very little overlap between those two things, and we've got a nice artifact to hand over between them. Sometimes it can be misleading. We need to be careful that maybe there are some business rules or some logic that's very similar or the same in both of those. So it's not always a good split, but it's something to look for in these sessions. And once you've done that, once you've started playing around with pivotal events and looking for these different kind of behaviors, the event storm then becomes a template or a platform or a foundation where you can start exploring these domain boundaries. As you can see here, this is a presentation version. It looks nice and neat and all clustered in nice straight lines, and everything's organized together. In reality, it's a bit more messy than this. You might have bits of domain A over here and over here. So I don't want to oversimplify things, but you can have a very effective discussions and design sessions with an event storm. One thing to look out for is the concept of a customer journey versus a subdomain. With event storming, it's a timeline-based approach, so it encourages you to think about these phases in the process. And very often in these workshops, I'll see things like, oh, these 5 or 6 events here, that's the onboarding phase. And from a user journey perspective, it is, but what we need to do then, once we identify these phases or subdomains, we need to ask the question, do all the events we've identified here match up with the name? So we can see here we've got personal information, driving license verified, funds added to an account. Those to me are different capabilities with different rules and different data. And so whilst onboarding is a journey, in this example, I would say we've got some different subdomains or different domains here. So that's one of the key things that catches people out with event storming. So that's the first part of this potential process you might go through. Get people together. Doesn't have to be a farm, but it's a nice place to have an event storming session. You can do things remotely as well. Map out your business, identify these domains and subdomains. And at this point, you might go through multiple iterations of this, multiple workshops, but at some point, you'll have these domains and subdomains, and that's your candidate architecture boundaries and your candidate team boundaries. So at this point, we probably don't have a super high level of confidence. We need to go through some more refinement steps first to increase our confidence and maybe identify some aspects we missed and refine those choices a bit. And so that's where team topologies is very useful. Team topologies can help you to assess your domain boundaries from a team aspect, from a social aspect. So if you're not familiar with team topologies, I think it was published 2 or 3 years ago now, so still quite a new thing, but it's been very popular. The authors were recently tweeting about how they sold 100,000 copies, so congratulations to them. Hard life, but it has been very influential. I think there's new stuff in team topologies, some of the patterns and concepts, but also a lot of the things that I noticed from successful organizations over the past 10 years have now been brought into here. Things like you build it, you run it. they've become more mainstream thanks to the book. So I do think the book's a great resource to learn. And so in a practical perspective, you might read the Team Topologies book, or you might not have time to read the book, but you might still want to apply these ideas when you're shaping your domains and subdomains and organizing your teams. And so I recently found the independent service heuristics they created on GitHub as a useful technique. It's like a checklist. You find your potential domain and team boundaries, and you go through this checklist as a series of further analysis and refinement. So I've got a case study here for you from a company I was working with earlier this year. So just going to go through it in effectively, or it's not exactly in order, but it doesn't make too much difference, so I'll carry on. So basically, the first question is, would the cognitive load be bounded to help the team focus and succeed? That's quite a vague thing. There's not a super amount of detail you can get from this, but there are some tips that can help you to answer that question. And so to answer that question, you do need to understand some of the basic theory in team topologies about what a team is. And so as you can see here, in team topologies, a team is small, defined as 5 to 9 people. That's based on some research and other studies. I don't know exactly how strong the science is behind that, but from my personal experiences, yeah, teams of 5 to 9 is generally in the sweet spot. So I don't argue with that too much. And also long-lived. If you've got lots of teams that are all touching, effectively, there are two aspects to that. Firstly, if you've got lots of teams that are touching different parts of the code base and they don't have ownership, that doesn't really fit this model. And if you're working in more of a project approach where you're regularly forming and reforming teams, that's not really compatible with this model either. If you start a project and form a team and then finish the project and then all of the team members go work in a different team, this model is not compatible with that approach. They're very opinionated. A team is small and long-lived. They own something and they stay together for a long time. It doesn't mean you can't change members of the team. There's some flexibility there. So this is what we mean by a team, and that can help the question, answer that first question a bit. Also, the book talks a lot about cognitive load, about not giving teams too many responsibilities to own. So again, when we start thinking about domains and subdomains, we need to think about this part of that event storm feels cohesive. It feels like it's one thing, but actually we'd need a team of 15 people to own all of that with the amount of work we're planning to do there. So from a cognitive load perspective, it's too big and it would have to be split. So then you might go to the specification and execution as a way to split that into smaller pieces. So the next part of ISH is asking, could a team own something independently? How many dependencies and blockers would a team have when they're working through a typical feature? And so the team topologies interaction modes are quite useful here, helping you to understand how much cognitive load and how many blockers are introduced into the team or are affecting the team. So the three interaction modes are collaboration, X as a service, and facilitating. Collaboration is broadly defined as teams are working towards some shared goal, and there's a cost to this kind of collaboration. Teams need to have synchronized backlogs, shared rituals, meetings, possibly retrospectives, workshops together. So there's a cost to this mode. So if we see a team that has too many collaboration interactions happening at the same time, that's a warning sign to look out for. X as a service is where one team is using the capabilities of another team, but there's minimal cognitive load. A very simple example is if you're using a cloud provider like Azure or AWS, for example, when you want to spin up a new Lambda or function or virtual machine, you don't have to go talk to someone. It's all automated. You're using that as a service, and they're taking that model and applying that within an organization. And facilitating is where one team's helping another to achieve one team's particular goal. So they're sacrificing themselves a bit. So this is useful when we look at cognitive load. We can draw diagrams a bit like this using team topologies, and we can start to identify problems. So in this organization, I'd had some meetings with various stakeholders, and people were always talking about this integration platform team. They're difficult to work with, they're a bottleneck, they're unfriendly, they're unresponsive. So we thought something might be going on in that space. Maybe they've got some difficult people, maybe it's personnel issues. So anyway, we had some workshops with the teams involved, including the integration platform. Very quickly, in less than an hour, we mapped out this team topology, and the answers were pretty clear straight away. You can see the integration platform has 4 collaboration relationships here. So that's a very high cognitive load. And what was actually happening was the integration platform team, they weren't being difficult, they were trying to be too nice. So in team topologies, a platform team is building self-service tools and capabilities for other teams, generic things that other teams can use. What was happening here was those streamlined teams you can see, the in-store team, the order history team, this was quite a big company with lots of different regions, and those teams didn't have the budget or the expertise to build their own integrations with the integration platform, their own API endpoints. And so the integration platform team, they were building lots of bespoke stuff specifically for those teams to be used. And this was also hinted at when the integration platform weren't sure, are we a platform team or are we a stream-aligned team? Turns out they were both trying to do too many things, and these relationships also pointed to that. The next thing from ISH is, again, going back to the first part of the talk, we looked at John Cutler's diagram. Does the team have the autonomy to own their roadmap? Can the team be in control of their decisions? And so in this example, this was a company working in e-commerce in a healthcare-related industry. We did some workshops, we had some interviews, and we found that effectively this team was, there were a number of problems, but the key one I want to get across here is that this platform team didn't have their own budget. They would only get money to build things from the the platform team is building some generic capabilities, and there are 3 verticals in the company which are customer facing. And basically the platform team doesn't get their own budget. They only get money when the vertical team says, can you build this for us? And if you build it, we'll pay you. Now the problem with this approach is that the platform team doesn't have time to build in quality, and they don't have any non-business as usual budget to address longer term issues. When they're building a new feature for the vertical, they can only build exactly what the vertical wants. And so they're not able to build a solution that works for all of these verticals because there's no budget to think about that. So we identified in this example, it's not really going to work here. It doesn't satisfy the ISH criteria. This team has probably 10% control over their own roadmap, and it should be like 80% or 90%, so a very strong problem there. Which example was this? I've forgotten now. Oh yeah, this was another example. What I wanted to explain here was, when some companies go through this process, it's not always a management issue that's the problem. Sometimes it's people aren't used to these new behaviors. So in this example, company went from projects to products, and a lot of people got new responsibilities, and effectively we had a community of practice for the platform owners, and they were trying to work out, how do we adopt this new way of working? And we had this one session, and one of the platform owners said, now we're working in this new platforms and products approach, this team topologies approach, I'm not getting the priorities I need from the business. He's like, they're not giving me straight answers. He said, I recently got an email from one of the key stakeholders, one of the key business unit leads. I can show you if you like. So we looked at this email, and he asked her for some clarification about what his team should work on. And she basically said, I think these 3 or 4 areas are the key things to focus on, but I'm going to let you decide. You own the platform, you're the expert. I'm going to let you decide. Now, he saw that as, I'm not getting clear requirements. I've been so used to working in this project way where I'm told exactly what to build. She was giving him the autonomy and the ownership to decide you and your team can make these decisions yourself, and he just didn't see that. So that's one of the other things to look out for here. It's not always a management forcing the company to work in a certain way. As you go through this transition, people don't realize the changes that are expected of them in this new approach, and that's kind of a common thing we might see. Yeah, that's the same part of the same story. So this is going to be part 3 of the journey now. We've looked at identifying domain boundaries. I've talked about a few of those independent service heuristics you can use to assess the organizational and team aspects. With this third part, I'm going to talk about core domains, and that's helping you to get a sense of where's important, where do we start, where's the biggest opportunity for applying team topologies or some new practices or ways of working on this long journey of transforming the organization from project to product. Yeah, where's the most value? What's the starting point? Those kind of questions. So in domain-driven design, we talk about core, supporting, and generic. These are quite broad classifications for assigning some strategic importance to each subdomain. Effectively, a core domain is where the areas where your business perceives or believes or does gain some competitive advantage. Some people say that's the special sauce, for example, or what makes us different, that kind of thing. Supporting subdomains are things that are unique to your industry, contains business concepts relevant to your industry, but they're not super differentiating. It might be things like table stakes features. You need to have it, but beyond a certain point, there's no benefit to making it awesome. And then generic subdomains, those are things which are common across many different industries, email systems, payments, things that you typically want to buy off the shelf where possible, but not always. And so in this example, this was based on a startup in London. They were going from, I think, around like 100, 150 employees. They wanted to get some Series B funding and move to a bigger, they wanted to scale out their business model and grow their company. And so we looked at all of these opportunities they talked about as domains that could be evolved. The arrows here represent how the company could evolve. There's different areas. So arrows going down, like domain B, that's where current systems are too complex, the cost of running them is high. Let's make those simpler to reduce the cost and maybe put less people working on them. And then arrows going up and to the right is usually we want to build more stuff in these subdomains and make them more valuable. So in this example of the company in London, the startup / scale-up in London, talking to head of data, head of engineering, went through all these problems they talked about, and one thing that stood out is a certain kind of change they were making would touch 4 different parts of the system at the same time. So, quite a high level of coupling. Change this part of the code, change this part of the code, change this part of the code, change this part of the code. Yeah, very inefficient, very frustrating, very slow and painful. I'm sure we've all seen examples like that before. But what was even more interesting about this area was there was a manual process involving more than 30 people. Now think about how many people work in the company. You've got almost a quarter of your company involved in this manual process. One person does something, sends an email, someone updates a spreadsheet. Very frustrating from an operational perspective. And so we identified that in addition to the manual process, they've got what I would call a hidden subdomain here. These different parts that are spread out in the system that actually belong together and represent a cohesive subdomain. And so that was interesting because when we talked about where should the company start, which areas should the company improve first, naturally people always went towards the core domain, which is generally good advice. Let's put the effort where we get most value. So the gut instinct or the natural instinct there was these 2 core domains. Let's spend more time improving those. But by going through this, by mapping these out as a core domain chart, we could show that this supporting subdomain we called domain B, the complexity was very high, the code changes and the manual processes. By fixing that first, it would save a lot of time for starters and stop frustrating a lot of people. But also, those 2 core domains depended to implement new core domain features. there would be changes required in the supporting domain. So using this core domain chart, we were able to make the case for start by fixing B first and then address your core domains later. It's not a pattern I would say always do this. All I'm saying is when you use the core domain chart and you map out all the opportunities, sometimes you can get a different narrative, or you can have certain conversations that take you in a different direction. With these core domain charts, there are some patterns I tend to notice, and the thing that's useful about these patterns is it's affecting how we behave. So if we see something in the top right-hand corner, it's very valuable to the company, and it's very complex. So the more effort we put in here, there's potentially a very long-term advantage. It's hard for competitors to copy. So our mindset here would be things like event storming, things like building high-quality code, things like getting the whole team talking to the customer, any effort here to find new ideas and to keep the system sustainable and evolvable, that will have maximum benefit here. If we map out our subdomains and we see something in this position, still in the core domain but further down, well, now it's much less complex, so it's much more likely that a competitor can copy this, and so we would probably put less investment there. We might do some event storming, but not as much. We still want to create well-designed code, but maybe certain architectural patterns, we wouldn't use them here. Maybe we could afford to have a bit more of a monolith here, because it's got a shorter lifespan, we expect. Another interesting pattern I see is around current versus future. And what I call here is the big bet future core. You've identified some subdomain in the company. It's not currently making money. It's not currently being used. The company's trying to figure out how could we make some value from this. And what I find is resources, or let's say people, not just people, other kinds of resources, money, time, people, get pulled away from these things because they're not making money. I was working in one of these big bet future core domains a few years ago. I took 2 days off work and I came back on the Monday, and some people had been taken from my team. I'm like, well, where have they gone? What's going on here? So I talked to another team who'd borrowed those people, let's say, and the platform manager, he said, well, we've got an urgent deadline. We're working on a product that makes money. Yours doesn't make any money, so we deserve to have those people and you don't because you're not making money. So the key thing to get across here is whenever we see something that's a big bet future, we need to make sure that we're not sacrificing the future just for something that makes money now. It might be more important to focus on the future. So I learned from that experience, when you're working in a big bet future core, you need to really emphasize how important this could be for the company and how important it is to keep people working on it. Something else that's interesting is when you've got a high leverage supporting. In this example, you can see that there are 3 possible core domains that all depend on the supporting domain. And there's various different interpretations you could have from this. Some people often say, well, maybe the supporting domain's actually the core domain here. But the key thing is those 3 dependencies. You can see that you've got these 3 different core domains that all might want to move in different directions, but this supporting domain can be the bottleneck, and it's also quite complex. So even though it's supporting, in this example, even though it's supporting, it still has a high level of importance. We don't just want to say core domain, that's important, supporting domain, that's not important, generic, let's just buy something off the shelf. That's quite a broad classification, and what I'm saying here is when you use the core domain chart like this, you can have more fine-grained and nuanced conversations. This pattern I find is interesting, suspect supporting. How can something so complex be so of little value? Again, a couple of different scenarios here. It might just be that the code base has grown old over time and complex, lots of cruft, as Martin Fowler would say, or it might be that the company's placing too much value on something that's actually not that valuable. CTO joins a company, he says, oh, we need to have a new ERP system, or we need to build a new certain system, or we need to build a new XYZ. And so this is the CTO's pet project. He thinks it's important, putting a lot of effort and time into it, but actually it's not worth it. And very quickly, another kind of core domain chart I use from time to time is this modernization chart. It can help you to decide where should we start, what step should we take next. So in the bottom right-hand corner, you've got low-hanging fruit, something that's easy to modernize and quite valuable to do that. In the top left, you've got the last toothpaste in the tube, a part of your system which is really difficult to change and modernize and organize teams around it. And once you've done that, there's not much value anyway. So a couple of examples here would be, low-hanging fruit might be, we can build a brand new app that's totally decoupled from everything, and we'll get some immediate revenue from that. Low effort, high value, obvious starting point. Last toothpaste in the tube might be something like, we've got this 50 billion line stored procedure, which is crazy and messy, but even if we extracted that and cleaned it up, we probably wouldn't change it much anyway. So there's no benefit in going through all that effort right now. And then typically, companies are trying to find a balance between risk tolerant versus risk averse. I would say risk tolerant is where you're prepared to start with something a bit more complex or a bit more valuable, but because it's the first step in your journey, there's lots of unknowns, lots of patterns to establish, so you're taking a risk there, and it's important to acknowledge we are being risky or adventurous here. On the other hand, with risk averse, you're starting somewhere simple, but the payback isn't that great. One of the problems I've noticed when you're being risk averse is the business people who aren't connected to the tech might say, why are you spending 6 months to work on that part of the system that we don't really care about? There's not enough value attached to it. From your perspective, it's about taking a simple first step. But because there's no business value connected to that, it can be a difficult sell sometimes. All right, a couple of articles here. I find those two axes on the core domain chart, I made it look quite simple here, but to actually measure what is complexity and what's differentiation, it's actually really hard to do that. It's very subjective. Again, I don't want to oversimplify that process, so a couple of articles here that can give some insights. So, I'm almost finished now. If you're needing a toilet break or a coffee break or a food break, we're almost there. So finally, the first thing I would say is companies are moving to these different ways of working, and they look at domain-driven design and team topologies and event storming as approaches that can help. But the problem I see still is people expect too much in a short amount of time. Even though these techniques, even though I presented them in a linear flow today, in reality, it's a much more chaotic and organic process, taking a long amount of time. So I really don't recommend the big reorg approach. Even though you can map out an event storm and identify domains and subdomains, it doesn't mean you're going to transition to them within days or weeks. There is a long-term aspect here. If you want to practice these techniques, I've created a couple of katas. I've got a pre-prepared event storm and a pre-prepared core domain chart, and you can go through those steps on this example. If you want to create your own versions or modify these, please let me know. I'm always trying to create good examples to share with people. There's a bunch of other stuff I didn't have time for in this talk. Basically, if you go to github.com/DDD-crew, there's a bunch of repos containing tools and techniques and tips that we've been working on to try and make it easier to get into these concepts. And we're always accepting pull requests and comments, issues, ideas, complaints, anything. And if this talk didn't give you enough of a starting point and ideas about where to start, and you're thinking, yeah, where do I start? Then we put together this starter modeling process. This isn't supposed to be some kind of framework like SAFe that you follow step by step. It's just designed to help you take those first few steps in applying DDD and branching out to team topologies and other concepts. And so the very final thing I'd like to say is my recommendation for maybe not all of you, but some of you would be try and read the team topologies book. It's quite a short book, a lot of good ideas in there. And also try and run your first event storming session. I could talk to you about event storming for weeks, but just doing it for yourself and having those conversations and discoveries and seeing it all the magic happen, that's the only point where you'll really see how useful and valuable this technique is. And that's it. Thank you very much. Hopefully I didn't run over too long there.